Okay, perfect. So I want to give a little background on diseases that affect our region. And so this is a table with a lot of good information, but there's way too many words. So what it's showing are the top yield limiting diseases in the North Central region, broken down by each year. And so the North Central region includes the I-states, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, and North Dakota. So this ranking order is not specific to North Dakota, but it gives you a really nice general idea. And I also want to break it up by location of infection. So I'm breaking it up by root diseases, stem diseases, and foliar or leaf diseases. Number one across the board, SCN, soybean cyst nematode. I'm going to talk about that briefly, although we did have a student presentation, Kamal, who did a great job. He explained it a little bit. And then seedling diseases, SDS, which I'm also going to reference, and then Phytophthora, which is very similar to seedling diseases. So what I want to note is that seedling or root diseases in North Dakota are very important. They're really in the top 5 all the way. But specifically, SDS is not that high in North Dakota. It might be in other states in the North Central region, but in North Dakota, it is not having that large of an impact on yield. And that's just because it has not become established in North Dakota quite yet.
And it's not going to either, right?
Oh, I don't know about that. And then when you talk about stem diseases, you have to talk about white mold when you're in North Dakota. That's the most important stem diseases, although there are lots of others. Charcoal rot comes and goes depending on the year. Dry years, charcoal rot is very prominent. Brown stem rot, pod and stem blight, and stem canker. You see they're lower. There's quite a few stem diseases, but they are not having the same impact as root diseases do in North Dakota. And then leaf diseases, I'm making note, or there's 2 of them on this list, Septoria and frog eye. But again, I want to note that frog eye has not been around in North Dakota that much and is not really actively managed at this point. And that's because it's not taking away as much yield as other states in the North Central region. So SCN, number 1 across the board. And you can see it gives a number, and I believe that number represents thousands of bushels lost to that specific disease. So SCN might be 100 million bushels lost in any given year. So this is what it looks like. Kamal was able to show pictures. You could see the yellowish white actual nematode cyst on the root of the plant. And I like this picture because it compares it to a nodule, which is kind of in the mid left side. So you kind of get a size difference. So you can see. And so parasitic worm, Heterodera glycines, it's the top yield limiting pest, over $1 billion lost annually. One of the things that makes SCN such a troublesome pest is that it can establish extremely quickly in new environments. And in North Dakota, it has that opportunity a lot. I believe Stephanie earlier mentioned it was 7.25 million acres of soybeans grown. But SCN can also be a host on dry beans. And so that's probably over 8 million acres of crops in North Dakota that SCN can be a host on. Invasive, actively expanding, soil-borne pathogen, moves any way that soil can move. So that could be by wind, water, be on your boots, on tractor tires, could be on the feet of geese as they migrate. I don't know how likely that is, but it's a potential. It's favored by lighter soil, high pH, dry conditions, and it's overcoming genetic resistance. So I don't have any specific numbers, but I would have to say over 90% of the varieties that have SCN resistance are from PI 88788, and nematode populations are overcoming the resistance of that. And so management of it is becoming a little bit more, I wouldn't say complicated, but it needs to be engaged more in your decisions. And so it is an emerging pathogen. It's been here since 2003, but you can see how it started in 1954 in North Carolina and has just gone across the entire US. I believe each blip in this is about 6 years. So you can see how far it can move in like 6 years time. And in North Dakota, yes, it was in 2003, 2005, I believe, somewhere in there. And now I want to show some maps of a grower-based sampling program that was supported by the Soybean Council, where growers could send in soil samples to get egg levels results. So we can basically just get a survey of egg levels. And so first I'm showing the black dots. These are the negatives. I also want to note that there was over 1,400 entries for this. So you could see a lot of them are going to be in the east side, kind of similar to soybean acres in the state. And then gray is indicating low numbers, so like 50 to 200. These are potential false positives. Like if as a grower you're seeing like this, you kind of got to take it with a grain of salt. It might be real, it might not. Resampling is always the best. It's when we start getting into the colored ones that it's telling much more of a story. And so 200 to 2000 with susceptible varieties, you're starting to see a yield bump right there, or a yield loss right there. 2,000 to 10,000, you're starting to see yield loss, a little bit of yield loss, even with resistant varieties. Yellow, over 10,000 eggs per 100 cc of soil. It doesn't matter if it's a resistant variety, you're likely seeing yield loss. And populations can build extremely quickly because you can even just see the range. 200 to 2,000, you might be seeing some yield loss. But for some of the measurements we had 20,000 or 20,000 eggs per cc soil. And it's just a population boom. They're extremely quick in their reproductive cycle. And so this is just the same map without any of the negatives. And what I want to show in this picture is that you can see some yellowing in the crop that's caused from SCN being on the plants. But if you are seeing above ground damage, you are likely already seeing up to a 30% yield loss because it has to be a pretty severe infestation to start seeing above ground. I also want to note that these are not actually soybeans. This happens to be kidney beans, but it's the same regardless of which crop. If you were to dig this up and look underneath at the roots, you would very likely see those little cysts, but that can be a difficult way to identify it because a lot of the time in heavy clay soils, which you find, you can lose the cysts fall off very easily. So what we recommend to growers is get your field sample and send it in because that's the easiest way to know that you have an infestation. You can figure out how severe your infestation is. And then by doing it more in the future, you can see how your management is affecting your infestation levels. And so that's what we try to focus on is ask people to sample. Managing it, I had mentioned resistance, but a lot of the major source of resistance is becoming overcome. Crop rotation works to non-host crops, but again, dry beans, which is a crop that's grown on almost 1 million acres, is a host to it also. Some seed treatments. We do point a lot of people to the SCN Coalition, which is a partnership that NDSU leads with other universities and private companies that act as a voice to bring awareness to SCN and give management recommendations based on individuals and where they're living and which specific state they're in. And I have at the bottom here, SCN can make other disease worse. And I will specifically talk about that with SDS, so sudden death syndrome later. So here's just another plug for SCN. My boss, Sam, is really big on this, so I like to give him a plug every once in a while. Okay, SDS, sudden death syndrome. Classic foliar leaf of a severely infected plant. But if you remember earlier, SDS is actually a root-borne pathogen or a soil-borne pathogen. It affects the roots. And so I showed a picture of the leaf because what happens once infection occurs early in the season, it doesn't spread up. It produces a toxin that will spread up through the stem and into the leaf, which is what causes those foliar symptoms. And so you often see it more in wet springs, frequent rains, warm temps, because it is affecting the roots earlier in the life cycle of the plant. Intimately tied to soybean cyst nematode, and that could be kind of taken two ways. It's really believed that SDS is more severe in the presence of soybean cyst nematode. And it can also be tied to SCN because as SCN has moved across the United States, sudden death syndrome has kind of been lagging behind it, and it's just kind of it's been moving across the United States with it just a little bit later, about 10 years, a lot of people say. It says number 2 to number 5 yield threat in the north central US, but that is not specific to North Dakota. And that's because we only first found it in 2018 in Richland County, down in the far southeast corner. And then we were not able to positively identify it again until 2020, over 200 miles away, way up north by the Canada border in Cavalier County. And so those at the moment are the only 2 positive identifications for SCS we have in the state. But just thinking about the spatial difference, it appears that it is more prevalent than people know, or that we know, and what other people. And so the black counties outlined are the counties that have had positive identification of SCN in the state. And so I put it up here because that might be some sort of indication for where SDS could be. And so here's just kind of the beginning of the foliar symptoms that develop from SDS. And again, this is not the actual pathogen, it's the toxin that is produced from the pathogen in the roots moving through the stem and into the leaves. And so you start seeing these yellow circular lesions that are chlorotic tissue that does not develop across veins. And you can see kind of as it develops more, the yellowing becomes necrotic and never really crossing a vein. And so you can get in severe foliar symptoms, the veins really perfectly normal green with the chlorotic and then necrosis interveinally. Pretty common to see all the leaves fall off, just the petioles sticking up. You can see that in kind of circular areas of a field. So this is kind of showing that too. No leaves, just petioles kind of sticking up. So you still kind of see the green leaves. One of the diagnostic things for SDS is the cross section of a soybean will have a brown cortex with a nice white pith, which is diagnostic because there's another disease that does the exact opposite, where it's a white cortex with a black pith, kind of like a pencil. Brown stem rot, you can kind of imagine that as a pencil, and SDS is the exact opposite. And so kind of the disease cycle, and I'm adding this in here again just to make note that the pathogen is only present in the roots and that it's a toxin that's produced and goes upward, which causes the foliar symptoms and the stem symptoms. Relationship is complicated because SDS can occur without soybean cyst nematode, but it's likely that symptoms appear earlier, are a little more contrasted, and the yield impacts are likely more severe with SCN present. For management in North Dakota, detective, we just got to know how big of a problem it is. Best way to do that, we recommend, is bring the whole plant, because a lot of people would think that the pathogen is present in the leaves. And so if you just get a sample of the leaves and the stem, you don't ever really get a chance to isolate the pathogen because it's actually in the roots. So for diagnosing it, getting the whole plant is best. Resistance, seed treatments are available, but I feel like the little bit of research I've seen personally on that is in high disease environments, seed treatments are effective. And seed treatments are effective because it is a soil-borne disease, not a foliar disease, although you see the foliar symptoms. Okay, frog eye leaf spot. Important, was just recently found in North Dakota. It had mentioned again that it's in the top 10 yield limiting diseases, but that's in other states. So first officially recorded in North Dakota in 2020. Officially is in parentheses because based on a survey that we had done in 2020 when we first found it, we found it in a lot of places. So we're saying officially in North Dakota, but likely it was probably present earlier than that. Cercosporasogena, that genus is also causes a very important disease in sugar beets. This is a true foliar disease. The pathogen is present on the leaves. Common in warm and humid environments, more severe, which is why it's it's more impactful in the South. Residue and seed borne, $100 million in losses. And so this is pretty classic symptoms. They call it frog eye because each one of those little lesions is supposed to mimic what a frog's eye would look like. It's kind of an angular, dark purple brown outside with a lighter tan on the inside. You flip it over and you notice it's kind of more of a dark gray. And when you look in really close, you can see kind of it tufting out, and it's the actual fungus that's growing on the bottom side of the leaf there. And so I alluded to a survey we did. We found it late in August in 2020, and we were really surprised because it never been reported in the state. And so with support from the Soybean Council, we got the resources together to do a survey real quick. And so out of 11 counties, 5 fields in 5 random fields in each county were selected, and we found it in almost every single county. Grand Forks, we found it in 1 of 5 fields, and in Barnes, we found it in 4 or 5 fields, but everywhere else, it was just everywhere, which is why I say officially found in 2020, but likely it had been here the year before, had overwintered. And so that's why it was so prevalent. In yellow, I have highlighted counties that likely also would have seen frog eye leaf spot. And so management, it's about, in the South, it is managed much more because it's much more of a problem. In North Dakota, we're still looking for positive identification, trying to get a figure about how impactful it is and will be to people in North Dakota. And so management, resistance, crop rotation, cultural things, because it's residue borne and seed borne. So conventional till, or just getting rid of residue, however you want to do about that. Fungicide options are available. And historically, fungicides have been pretty effective, but recently there's been resistance to a class of fungicides, strobilurins, which has been a problem because strobilurins are very effective. And so as part of that survey that we had done earlier, we sent our samples down to University of Kentucky just to confirm frog eye. And he was also able to run PCR to see that it was resistant, or to show that the samples that we sent down were showing some resistance to strobilurin fungicides. And so what I'm showing up here, each pie chart is geographically located on the spot where the field was surveyed. And the pie chart is showing the proportion of samples that are either susceptible to QOIs or strobilurins. QOIs and strobilurins are the same thing. Or a proportion of samples that are resistant to QOIs. And so the yellow is showing the resistant, and there's not been active management for frog eye in North Dakota. But what this is showing is that the populations moving in have already evolved resistance to certain QOI fungicides. And so because one of the management strategies further south they've had the option of fungicides, and that's starting to fail. It might be a problem because the populations here are also showing resistance. And that's all I got. Nice quick update. And thanks to Soybean Council because they funded each little project in each 3 disease. So thank you. Does anyone have questions?
Any questions?
Thanks. Has there been sampling for the SEN to determine what race or races are kind of the predominant races? You said they're overcoming the 88788 type resistance. So I imagine there's shifting populations there. Are you all evaluating that at all, or?
I specifically am not evaluating that. Someone in Dr. Jan's lab might know more about that.
Yeah, we have a nematologist here at NDSU.
Mhm.
Dr. Yan.
what was the race number? 1257? Is that what you said? The one that was?
Yeah, 157 is the end of the month.
Yeah.
Because we check the form. Yeah, we should know. People attack.
Do you know more of an exact number on the percent of varieties that are from 88, 788 resistance?
Yeah, I think that overall is that over.
Over 90, yeah. I
Yeah,
don't
and
remember.
even in our one, you mentioned over.
Oh, yeah, okay. Were there any other questions?